Hey guys, and welcome to week 3 of International Business. This week we're going to continue on from last week where we looked at the global political economy and differences across nations there, and look more specifically this week at the level of economic development that we see across different areas of the globe and what this means for you guys as future international business managers. We're also going to have a look at those economies that are emerging like our adorable little canine friend here from more of a traditional state-run, centrally planned economy towards more of a market-based system, and again highlight what this means for you guys moving forward as international business managers. So with that in mind, we're going to start by hopefully explaining to you guys the different ways in which we are able to measure economic development. There are a few different forms that are commonly employed, and we're going to go through those today. By the end of this week, we're hoping that you guys will also understand why countries differ in their level of economic development, some of the key reasons why that is so. Thirdly, we're going to discuss emerging and transition economies and their movement towards a more market-based system. And finally, understanding why there has been that general movement and why we've seen this transitioning towards greater levels of democracy and market-based systems. To achieve all that, we first need to start with understanding what we mean when we talk about economic development. Now, certain countries around the world have dramatically different levels of economic development. It's certainly not the case that we see a global standard there, and that's due to a number of different factors. Certainly, if we look at things like natural endowments, that is those naturally based factors that are found in certain parts of the world, obviously that will differ as you go and travel across the globe and indeed conduct your business across the globe. We're very fortunate here in Australia and even more specifically here in Melbourne that we live in a part of the world that is blessed with significantly or substantial levels of factor endowments there. Innovation and entrepreneurship and how that differs across the globe is also a key contributing factor. Again, Australia is quite high in its levels of innovation and entrepreneurship within local businesses. That's not always the case across other parts of the world, and so that will certainly have a significant factor, or will be a significant factor in determining that economic development as well. The level of education is another key determinant. Again, here in Australia, we're very fortunate to have very high comparative levels of education, although you do sometimes wonder if certain demographics are a little less educated than others. Sorry, Collingwood fans, I just couldn't help myself. Infrastructure is also a major factor to consider here, and again, we're very fortunate here in Australia to have high standards of things like the buildings, the roads, power supplies, and the other factors that are necessary to actually conduct business on a day-to-day basis. If we look at the different ways to measure economic development, there are a couple of commonly employed measures that we're going to look at today, to start with at least. The first is the gross national income, or GNI, per capita, and secondly is purchasing power parity, or PPP. Let's start with GNI, and this is regarded as a yardstick for the economic activity of a particular country, and measures the total annual income received by residents of a nation. That is, per year, what is the combined income of everyone who lives in that particular country. So it's a good way of demonstrating the general wealth that we see within a particular country. And this is because it doesn't measure or take into account differences in the cost of living. So say, for example, you identify that you're comparing the level of income in your country relative to that of another, and you identify that you have a higher gross national income per capita. That is, that you and the other people who live within your nation end up earning more per year than the people in the comparative nation. So you might be sitting there thinking, here we go, I am going to be Oprah rich, or I am Oprah rich here, Trump style. But then imagine that you compare the cost of living, that is obviously how much it costs to purchase the basic things to survive and live every single day, and you realize that that country that you're comparing yourself is actually significantly cheaper with these basic means of living. So even though you might be earning slightly more money per year, if it's costing you more to live, then overall you might go from being Oprah rich to having $0, well maybe not quite that, but certainly being less well off overall in terms of your actual purchasing power than the people who are living in the country that you're comparing yourself to. For this reason, a lot of economists actually prefer to use the purchasing power parity measure or PPP, to assess a country's level of economic development. Now this does adjust the GNI by the purchasing power within a particular country, and the uses as its base for the adjustment the cost of living in the United States, so it is biased somewhat towards the US, certainly in terms of its measurement. And the PPP for different countries is then adjusted up or down depending on whether the cost of living is either higher or lower than that of the US. So overall it gives a more accurate and realistic representation of the level of economic development within a particular country. What does this all mean for you guys and for your future businesses? Well, certainly when you are looking for potential target markets, those areas overseas that you might be considering expanding into, it's going to be advantageous to try and identify those areas with the highest levels of disposable income, because obviously when there are higher levels of disposable income, people will have more money available to spend on your product. So obviously the higher the level of economic development and disposable income, the more desirable that will potentially be as a target market for future expansion. To illustrate our point just briefly here, there is a figure in your textbooks which is available, but this is just an updated version of it, and it quickly illustrates the world, or demonstrates the gross national income per capita in 2015 across the globe. And as you can see by the key on the left hand side there, the target, or the markets in red, are the countries which have the highest level of income and potentially would be most attractive for you and your firm as you seek to internationalize overseas. So while these measures that we've discussed so far are certainly very important and potentially have significant implications for your firm when it looks to expand overseas, it is important to also acknowledge that they do have a couple of significant limitations, and that is for both the GNI and the PPP measures. Firstly, they do not necessarily reflect different classes and demographics within a population. So it gives you an overall measurement for the level of disposable income and the economic development within a nation, but it doesn't tell you, for example, that India has a particularly wealthy middle class. There's certainly a lot of poor people in India, and there's a very strong wealthy upper class, but India has a rapidly growing middle class who have significantly higher levels of disposable income, and these measures, the GNI and PPP, simply don't express that. There's also the issue of official figures not always telling the entire story. What we tend to find is that in a lot of especially less developed nations, there are large amounts of economic activity, sales and transaction and so on, in the form of unrecorded cash transactions, or potentially even barter agreements. That is effectively saying, I'll give you this if you do something for me in return, that doesn't necessarily involve actually any cash exchanging hands. And this is known as the black or shadow economy. And there's some research which actually suggests that as much as 50% of a nation like India's transactions are occurring in this method. That is, they are not effectively being recorded in these figures which contribute towards a nation's, or in this case India's, GNI or PPP. So it's not always accurate and reflective of the true entire story. Finally, another criticism to be mindful of here is that GNI and PPP only provide a static picture of development. That is, they can only capture the level of development at a particular point of time. It doesn't, on the other hand, give you any indication of the growth rate. That is, how rapidly or potentially slowly a nation's economic development is occurring. To be able to understand and appreciate this, you do need to go beyond these measures, these simpler measures of GNI and PPP, to also consider a nation's economic growth rates to give you a more dynamic picture of that country's level of economic development.